She didn't check out. She fled. That single word changes everything about the story you think you already know. Because checking out of a luxury resort is something ordinary people do. They pack their bags. They settle the bill. They move on. But fleeing is what you do when something finds you. When the walls close in around you. When the one place in the entire world you believed was yours, safe, secret, completely untouchable, suddenly isn't any of those things anymore. Sarah Ferguson fled an Austrian wellness retreat hidden in the Alps. And on the surface, that might sound like celebrity gossip. A disgraced duchess. A photographer. A scandal. The usual tabloid noise that has followed this woman for 30 years. But stay with me. Because once you understand what that retreat actually meant to her, what she had called it on the record, in her own words, this stops being gossip entirely. This becomes something far darker. The story of a woman whose safe spaces are collapsing, one by one, like walls closing in from every direction. And what happens to someone like Sarah Ferguson when there is nowhere left to hide? Let's begin with the numbers. Because numbers don't lie the way public statements do. 213 days. That is how long Sarah Ferguson had been absent from public view before a photographer's lens finally found her at the Mare Life Retreat in Alta See, Austria. 213 days. That is not a holiday. That is not a wellness break. That is not even a long recovery. That is a deliberate, sustained, carefully managed disappearance. And the details that emerged about her behavior inside that retreat make it even more unsettling. She wasn't lounging by a pool. She wasn't dining in the restaurant, exchanging pleasantries with other wealthy guests, performing the role of the gracious, resilient duchess the world has come to expect. According to reports, she was keeping to herself with an almost obsessive intensity, ordering room service to her room rather than eating in public, avoiding the communal spaces entirely, moving through that resort like a woman who needed the world to believe she had ceased to exist. If those accounts are accurate, and we should note they remain accounts, not confirmed facts, then what we're looking at is not a woman on holiday. It's a woman in hiding. And here is where the story starts to cut deeper than a simple tabloid headline. Because this wasn't just any resort she happened to choose. This wasn't a random selection from a luxury travel brochure. This was the same Austrian wellness center that Sarah Ferguson had already invested with profound, public, emotional meaning. After completing her cancer treatment, she had praised this facility openly, directly, on the record. She described it as a safe place, a sanctuary. She used the word sanctuary. And she went further than that. She said it was one of the only locations on Earth where she could simply be Sarah. Not the Duchess. Not Andrew's ex-wife. Not the woman from the scandals. Not the cautionary tale. Just Sarah. Think about what it takes to make an admission like that. To publicly confess that you can only be yourself in one specific place, in one specific country, behind closed doors. That is not the statement of a confident woman in control of her narrative. That is the admission of someone who has been performing a version of themselves for so long that the authentic self has almost no space left to breathe. So when photographers found her there, when her location became public knowledge, she didn't simply adjust her plans. She didn't give a gracious comment to the press and move to a different wing of the hotel. She left. Her sanctuary collapsed the moment the world looked at it. And that collapse tells you everything you need to know about how fragile her position has truly become. To fully understand what Austria represented, you have to understand what the years before it looked like. In June 2023, Sarah Ferguson revealed she had undergone a single mastectomy following a breast cancer diagnosis discovered through routine screening. She handled the announcement with characteristic openness, the candor that has always been both her greatest asset and her most dangerous vulnerability. Then, just 7 months later, in January 2024, came the second blow. A diagnosis of malignant melanoma. A second cancer. A second battle. And sources close to her confirmed something quietly devastating, that she had initially recuperated in Austria. At that same retreat. In that same sanctuary. So when she returned there, she wasn't simply seeking luxury. She wasn't choosing Alta See because of the mountain views or the 5-star menus. She was returning to the place where her body had begun to heal, where the worst chapter of her recent life had slowly, painstakingly started to close. And when cameras pierced that privacy, they didn't just expose a duchess at a spa. They turned her recovery into tabloid content. They made even her illness a spectacle. There is a particular kind of cruelty in that Not a deliberate cruelty, perhaps, but a structural one. The machinery of royal scrutiny doesn't pause for illness. It doesn't distinguish between scandal and survival. If you are Sarah Ferguson, every moment of your life is potentially a headline, including the moments when you are simply trying to get well. And the question that follows from all of this is the one that really keeps you awake at night. What happens when even your place of healing becomes a place you have to flee? Now we have to ask the question that shadows Sarah Ferguson almost everywhere she goes. The question she has never been able to fully escape, no matter how many times the narrative resets. Who was paying for this? The reported cost of her accommodation at the Mare Life Retreat was approximately £2,000 per night, £14,000 per week. For a sustained stay covering a significant period of time, the figures become extraordinary. And there is no confirmed public explanation for how that stay was funded. Now, that absence of clarity doesn't automatically constitute proof of anything improper. Wealthy people have wealthy friends. Arrangements are made. Private assistance is given. That is not by itself a scandal. But with Sarah Ferguson, financial questions land differently. Because they are not new territory. They are part of an established, documented, undeniable pattern that stretches back decades. In 2009, newly released documents revealed the full scale of the crisis she had been quietly managing. A reported £6 million debt. Discussions of potential bankruptcy. The consideration of selling personal jewelry. And here is the detail that changes the entire tone. Negotiations for rescue arrangements involving Jeffrey Epstein and others in his circle. Read that again. £6 million. Bankruptcy discussions. Epstein. Then, just 1 year later, the 2010 Cash for Access scandal. Secretly filmed. Apparently offering access to Prince Andrew in exchange for money. The footage broadcast internationally. The humiliation total and immediate. That was the pattern. Financial pressure building invisibly beneath the surface. Then a desperate attempt to solve it. Then catastrophic exposure. Then retreat, reinvention, and the slow, painstaking rebuild. So when reports suggest she may currently be relying on the assistance of wealthy friends whose identities and motivations remain conveniently vague, royal watchers don't see a new twist in the story. They recognize the echo. And echoes in royal scandals are never reassuring. Because they suggest not isolated incidents, but something deeper. Something structural. Something that keeps reasserting itself no matter how many times the surface narrative resets. Financial pressure, though, may not even be the most serious problem she faces right now. Because in 2025, something happened that crossed a line that is very difficult to uncross. 7 charities severed their connections with Sarah Ferguson. Not 1, not 2, 7. Children's charities. Major health organizations. Institutions that had, for years, been willing to overlook the accumulated scandals in exchange for the profile and fundraising power her name could bring. All of them walked away. The trigger was the publication of a 2011 email in which she appeared to refer to Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted sex offender, a man she had publicly distanced herself from, as her supreme friend, and to have apologized to him after that public distancing, apparently to prevent litigation. Her spokesperson responded that the message had been sent on legal advice, that she continued to deeply regret any association with Epstein, and it should be noted that PBS, citing the Associated Press, reported that the email's authenticity could not be independently verified. That caveat matters. It matters legally. It matters journalistically. In a court of law, unverified evidence is inadmissible. But we are not in a court of law. We are in the court of public perception. And in that court, the rules are entirely different. Perception moves faster than evidence. Damage calculates before verification. And when 7 charities simultaneously decide that your name has become a liability, that the risk of association with you now outweighs any benefit, the signal they are sending is unmistakable. The brand is damaged. The circle of support is contracting. And the room around you gets smaller with every passing month. For years, for decades, really, Sarah Ferguson had a safety net that nobody else in her position could quite claim. Prince Andrew. They divorced officially in 1996. But they never fully separated. They remained extraordinarily close. They continued living under the same roof at Royal Lodge in Windsor. They co-parented. They traveled together. They attended the same functions. They operated, in many visible ways, like a couple who had formally ended the marriage contract but never truly ended the underlying bond. And whatever you make of that arrangement, it provided Sarah with something precious: stability, structure, a fallback position that prevented complete freefall regardless of what was happening around her. When the scandals came, and they always came, there was still Royal Lodge. There was still Andrew. There was still the familiar York cocoon that kept the worst outcomes at bay. But then Andrew's own world began to fracture. His association with Jeffrey Epstein, the catastrophic BBC Newsnight interview of 2019, the withdrawal of royal duties, the civil lawsuit, the settlement, the complete and total institutional distance that the royal family drew between themselves and the Duke of York. And with that fracturing came something Sarah Ferguson may not have anticipated. Reports emerged suggesting that Andrew was facing pressure to vacate Royal Lodge, that he could no longer maintain his position there given the costs involved and the palace's changing attitude toward him. And if Andrew goes from Royal Lodge, Sarah goes with him. Suddenly the old safety net doesn't look like security at all. It looks frayed, unreliable, and potentially gone entirely. That shift, the possible removal of the one constant that had anchored her through every previous crisis, may explain more about the Austrian disappearance than any other single factor, because it suggests that the fallback position she has relied on for 30 years may no longer exist. And without it, she is navigating this without a net for the very first time in her adult life. Here is the thing about Sarah Ferguson that you have to hold in your mind even as all of this unfolds. She has survived before. She has survived things that would have ended other people. The toe-sucking tabloid photos of 1992. The public humiliation so total, so visceral, that the Queen reportedly refused to invite her to the family's Balmoral gathering for years afterward. The 2010 sting operation. The Epstein connections that have circled her name for a decade. The bankruptcies, the debts, the desperate arrangements that kept becoming very public indeed. Every single time, she came back. Through books, through television appearances, through podcasting, through children's publishing, through brand partnerships and celebrity interviews, and a seemingly inexhaustible willingness to convert personal catastrophe into visibility. She has always found another avenue, another door to walk through when the previous one closed behind her. Even in recent years, she had moments of genuine soft re-entry into sympathetic public narrative. She expressed warmly public support for Princess Catherine following Catherine's cancer announcement. She spoke with raw honesty about her own diagnoses and drew genuine sympathy from audiences who found her vulnerability more compelling than any polished royal statement. The woman has instincts. Remarkable, battle-tested, repeatedly proven survival instincts. There are already voices in royal circles floating a possibility that no one at Buckingham Palace wants to say out loud. A memoir, or a tell-all interview, or a documentary, or some form of extended, authorized account that would allow Sarah Ferguson to finally say, on her own terms, everything she has never fully said before. To be absolutely clear, that remains speculation. There is no confirmed book deal, no announced project, no verified negotiation with any publisher or broadcaster. But here is why that speculation gains traction so immediately, so naturally, every time it surfaces. Sarah Ferguson knows things. She has been intimately close to Prince Andrew through every chapter of the crisis that has consumed him. She was inside the York household during events that the palace would prefer remained forever private. She understands the royal machinery in ways that very few people outside the family ever fully do. And she has been positioned, whether by choice or by circumstance, close enough to multiple eras of institutional crisis to understand precisely where the vulnerabilities lie. If she ever calculated that staying quiet was no longer protecting her, that silence had stopped being a shield and had started being a trap, the market value of her story would increase immediately and dramatically. And the palace knows that calculation as well as she does. Which means that somewhere in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, behind the carefully managed statements and the cultivated institutional distance, there is almost certainly a quiet, sustained anxiety about exactly what Sarah Ferguson might eventually decide to say. And to whom. And when. Step back from the individual details for a moment. The Austrian retreat. The 7 charities. The financial questions. The Royal Lodge uncertainty. The Epstein connections. The cancelled plans and the compressed options. Step back and look at the shape of it. What you see is a pattern. a pattern so consistent across 30 years that it has almost become predictable. Sarah gets exposed. Sarah experiences public humiliation. Sarah retreats from view. Then Sarah attempts to rebuild through some form of reinvention. The surface details change with every cycle. The addresses change. The scandals change. The specific forms of exposure change. But the underlying rhythm stays exactly the same, like a clock that keeps striking the same hour no matter how many times you try to reset it. The only meaningful difference now, the thing that makes this particular cycle feel genuinely different from every previous one, is that the space available for recovery is shrinking. The York household foundation is less stable than it has ever been. The charity sector has grown colder and far more risk-averse. The public mood is measurably less forgiving than it was even a decade ago. The persistent questions around money and financial arrangements have never fully dissipated. And the institutional support of the royal family, which was always at best grudging, at worst non-existent, has effectively evaporated alongside Andrew's own standing. She has fewer doors than she has ever had, and the doors she still has are narrower. So where does Sarah Ferguson go from here? That is the question at the center of all of this. And the honest answer is that nobody, not royal watchers, not palace insiders, not even, perhaps, Sarah Ferguson herself, knows with any certainty. There are 3 possible trajectories, and none of them are comfortable. The first is a return to public life through one more carefully constructed reinvention. Another book, another interview, another carefully managed reintroduction designed to remind the world of the Sarah Ferguson they found charming and resilient and unexpectedly sympathetic. It has worked before, multiple times. The question is whether the audience still exists in sufficient numbers to make it work again. The second trajectory is deeper withdrawal. A life lived quietly, supported by loyal and wealthy friends whose identities remain deliberately vague. A managed disappearance that doesn't announce itself as permanent, but simply allows the noise to slowly die down until there is nothing left to say. Safe, perhaps. But for a woman who has spent 30 years in the center of the story, it would represent something close to erasure. And the third trajectory is the one that makes the palace genuinely nervous. The confession. The tell-all. The moment when Sarah Ferguson decides that privacy has stopped protecting her, and that the most powerful move left on the board is simply to speak. Everything. Completely. Without restraint. That possibility, remote or otherwise, is what keeps this story alive even in the quietest moments. Because the value of her silence has always depended entirely on what that silence is protecting. And the moment she decides it is no longer protecting anything worth protecting, the entire calculation changes. What makes this latest chapter so revealing is that it doesn't look glamorous, even though it's wrapped in the trappings of luxury. On paper, an alpine medical spa sounds opulent and desirable. But the picture being constructed through these reports is of a woman staying behind closed doors, avoiding public spaces, and then relocating the moment her cover is blown. That isn't freedom. That is containment. And for a woman who once seemed almost impossible to silence, who turned every scandal into a platform, every crisis into a comeback, every humiliation into the raw material of a new chapter, there is something genuinely striking about that image. Not because Sarah Ferguson has lost her survival instinct. If anything, 30 years of evidence suggests that instinct is almost impossible to extinguish. But because survival instinct alone is no longer enough when the structural conditions that made survival possible keep disappearing one by one. The charm still works, sometimes. The resilience is still real. The instinct for converting crisis into visibility is still there. But all of it becomes exponentially harder to execute when the background narrative keeps circling back to the same pressure points. Financial questions, compromising associations, institutional distance, shrinking options, different decade, different scandal. The only question that remains, the question this channel will keep watching, keep examining, keep refusing to look away from, is whether the next chapter of Sarah Ferguson's story is the one she finally chooses to write herself, or whether someone else writes it for her first.